Daniel Carter walked into Harrison and Company like he belonged there. Fresh out of college, he had the kind of confidence that made people take notice. His handshake was firm, his smile effortless, and his charm disarming. Within weeks, he had settled in, becoming a rising star in the firm. He wasn't just good at his job, he was exceptional. Clients liked him. Colleagues admired him. Even Richard Harrison, the man who had built the company from the ground up, saw something in him. Richard had been in the business long enough to recognize talent when he saw it. Daniel reminded him of himself at that age, driven, ambitious, willing to do whatever it took to get ahead. He saw potential, someone who could carry the company forward in the years to come. So, he took him under his wing, offering mentorship, inviting him to meetings usually reserved for senior partners, giving him access to opportunities others only dreamed of. But Daniel was more than just a promising employee. He had a magnetic presence, the kind that drew people in, particularly the women in the office. He had a way of making them feel special, as if they were the only person in the room when he spoke to them. It was subtle, just enough attention to spark curiosity, just enough distance to keep them wanting more. And most importantly, he knew how to keep secrets. Richard wasn't oblivious to office dynamics. He knew that attraction and affairs weren't uncommon in a high-pressure workplace like this. But Daniel was different. He wasn't just flirting, he was calculating. The late-night meetings, the quiet conversations, the lingering glances, they all suggested something deeper, something more dangerous. One afternoon, Richard noticed Daniel leaning against Sophia's desk. Sophia was one of the firm's top consultants, brilliant, respected, married. She laughed at something Daniel said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her body angled just slightly toward him. It was subtle, but Richard had seen enough in his years to recognize the signs. The first red flag. At first, he brushed it off. Office friendships were normal. But as weeks passed, he started noticing more. The way Daniel's phone buzzed constantly with messages he never checked in public, the way certain female employees suddenly became more discreet, lowering their voices when he passed by. Then came the small inconsistencies. Daniel would step away from his desk for long periods with no explanation. He'd arrive early but leave late, though his workload didn't seem to justify it. One night, Richard spotted him outside the office, standing too close to a woman who wasn't his girlfriend, whispering something that made her laugh. Something wasn't right. Richard knew how power worked, how ambition could push people to blur the lines between right and wrong. He had made sacrifices, fought battles, lost friendships, all to build what he had today. And now, watching Daniel, he recognized that same hunger, but it came with recklessness. The kind that destroyed careers. He had taken a chance on Daniel, invested in him, given him everything he needed to succeed. But now, he wasn't sure if he had made a mistake. Because if there was one thing Richard had learned in his years at the top, it was this: a man who hides too much is a man who has something to lose. Richard wasn't the kind of man to act on impulse. He observed, gathered information, and waited for confirmation before making a move. But as days passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. Daniel was juggling something or someone behind the scenes, and it wasn't just one indiscretion. It was a pattern. The pieces started coming together when Richard overheard a hushed conversation in the break room. Two junior employees, whispering just low enough to suggest they knew they shouldn't be talking. Daniel's name came up. So did Sophia's. And then another name, Melissa. Melissa was in marketing, young, ambitious, and sharp enough to hold her own in the company. Richard hadn't paid much attention to her before, but now he started noticing things. The way Daniel's hand would linger just a little too long on her shoulder, the way she seemed nervous when they crossed paths in the hallway, the way she left early on days he did. One evening, Richard decided to stay late. He had no real reason to, just an instinct telling him something was about to happen. Sure enough, when most of the office had cleared out, Daniel walked past his door, unaware that Richard was still there. He wasn't alone. Melissa was with him. They disappeared into the conference room, and the door closed behind them. Richard knew he shouldn't care. It wasn't his business what Daniel did outside of work. But this was different. This was happening inside the company under his watch with employees who had careers to protect. One affair could be written off as a lapse in judgment. But two? That was carelessness. Minutes passed. Then the door opened. Melissa left first, her expression unreadable. Daniel followed a few moments later, his usual confidence intact. But Richard had seen enough. The next morning, he called Sophia into his office. Not to confront her, just to talk. He kept it professional, asking about her latest projects, her workload, anything that would force her to meet his eyes. She answered smoothly, but there was something in her posture, a slight stiffness that hadn't been there before. A hesitation. That was all the confirmation he needed. Daniel wasn't just reckless. He was dangerous. The kind of man who played games without considering the consequences. Affairs weren't new in corporate environments, but the way Daniel navigated them, so openly, so carelessly, meant he thought he was untouchable. Richard had built his company on control, on discipline, on knowing every moving part before it became a liability. Daniel had become a liability, and liabilities had to be dealt with before they turned into threats. He could ignore it, let Daniel burn himself out, let the mess untangle itself. But Richard knew better. Problems like this didn't resolve on their own. They spiraled. They pulled others down with them. And Richard wasn't about to let that happen. Not in his company. Not on his watch. Richard didn't act immediately. He watched, waited, let the situation unfold a little further. He needed to understand just how deep Daniel had embedded himself into the company's fabric before making his move. It became clear that Daniel thrived on risk. He wasn't just reckless, he was strategic in his own way. He knew how to manipulate situations, how to charm his way out of suspicion. But charm only worked when people weren't paying attention. And Richard was paying attention. Sophia had changed. She was sharper now, more guarded, no longer the confident executive assistant she had been before Daniel arrived. Richard noticed the subtle shifts, how she stayed late but left without a word, how she seemed distracted in meetings, how she avoided looking in Daniel's direction when they were in the same room. Melissa was different. She still carried an air of excitement, but it was tinged with nervous energy, as if she was constantly looking over her shoulder. Richard had seen this before. Affairs like this always followed the same cycle: intensity, secrecy, exhilaration, and then the slow unraveling when reality set in. And reality was about to set in. The office had its own rhythm, its own quiet way of spreading information. People noticed things even if they never spoke of them openly. A glance held too long, an inside joke that didn't fit, a tension that hung in the air after certain meetings. The whispers had started growing louder, the curiosity turning into something sharper. Then came the mistake. Daniel had gotten too comfortable, too sure of his control over the situation. Maybe it was arrogance, or maybe he truly believed no one would dare confront him. Either way, he slipped. A late-night email forwarded to the wrong person. A reservation under a name too easily traced back. A message seen by someone who shouldn't have seen it. Richard didn't know exactly what triggered it, but the shift was immediate. The murmurs turned into outright discussions. People who once brushed off the rumors started considering them seriously. And the weight of that scrutiny was something even Daniel couldn't ignore. Richard watched as Daniel's usual confidence wavered. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for someone who had been studying him. He became more cautious, less bold. He avoided unnecessary conversations, chose his words more carefully. He knew something was closing in on him, but it was too late. Richard had everything he needed. Proof? Maybe not in the traditional sense. But in corporate environments, perception was often more powerful than evidence. And once doubt took hold, it was nearly impossible to erase. The pieces were in place. Now, it was just a matter of deciding how the story would end. Richard didn't need to call Daniel into his office. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, he let the pressure build. He let Daniel feel the weight of something closing in on him without knowing exactly what it was. A strategic silence was more effective than an outright accusation. The tension in the office was palpable. People were watching, waiting for something to happen. Daniel tried to act normal, but it was clear he was struggling. His usual charm felt forced, His confidence cracked at the edges. The women he had entangled himself with were acting differently too. Sophia was distant, avoiding him altogether, while Melissa seemed unsure, as if realizing too late that she had bet on the wrong person. Then, the final push. A meeting, scheduled like any other, but with a different weight behind it. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Daniel took his usual seat, trying to mask his unease. There was no need for raised voices, no dramatic accusations. Instead, Richard laid it out with cold precision. The rumors, the mistakes, the undeniable pattern of behavior. For the first time, Daniel had no clever retort, no confident smirk. He knew there was no way out. His relationships had compromised the integrity of the company, and that alone was enough to seal his fate. There were no second chances for someone who had built their reputation on deception. Melissa's eyes darted away, as if regretting everything. Sophia sat rigid, expression blank, but Richard could tell she was relieved. She had gotten too close, but now she had an escape. Daniel tried to regain control, to argue, to downplay everything, but it was useless. The decision had already been made. His resignation was expected by the end of the day. There was no room for negotiation. As he left the room, the office seemed to exhale. The storm had passed, leaving only the remnants of its destruction. The damage was done, but at least now, there was clarity. Richard watched as Daniel gathered his things, his departure swift and quiet. No dramatic exit, no final words. Just the realization that, in the end, charm and manipulation could only get someone so far. The office moved on. Sophia reclaimed her confidence, Melissa distanced herself from the mess, and Richard ensured that lessons were learned. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. And some people, no matter how convincing, were never meant to be trusted at all.